What's up, Internet? You're tuning to episode 140 of the FlipScreen Games Podcast, a weekly video game podcast where two best buds from different nations come together to discuss the wide world of video games. I'm your host, Pete and Bessie, joined as always by my very good friend and co-host, Mr. Max Wright.
Hello.
Welcome back to the show, Max.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I just stole Panics and stole Steve's one.
Hey, you can do whatever you want, man. He's not here. He can't stop you. So we got a big week, Max. There is a hot rumor out that we're going to talk about here, and it is that Xbox has plans to release a new console in 2026, and that's not a revision, not a half gen refresh. That they would be kicking off their next gen console in 2026.
That makes sense to me. That's 6 years, right? It's short, but it's hardly
not unheard of.
Yeah.
And I feel like length of console cycles and everything, it's changed a lot over the last couple years, right? And it's like, back in the day, a normal life cycle was kind of closer to like 5 or 6 years, whereas, during like the Xbox 360, PS3 era, which was like during, the kind of the Great Recession, that kind of artificially extended the life cycle of that console generation quite a bit. And then we saw last gen kind of follow a similar trajectory. So I think a lot of folks kind of assume that that's where we're at now, right? It was just a few weeks ago on the show where we talked about how, Sony was saying how they felt like they were already halfway through the life cycle of the PlayStation 5. And I think a lot of people were surprised by that. But I guess when you start really nickel and diming it does make sense. It probably speaks more to the fact that the last few years have kind of time has been weird for people when you think about, how much of the last, this console cycle was like during lockdown and how that affects everybody's perception of time and everything.
Those consoles are worn out by now as well, because there's a lot of gameplay time done in that. There are some tired capacitors, there are some dead controllers, like there's also those things were used
caked in dust, all the fans,
Yeah, exactly.
So it's a story that I think will come as a surprise to some and maybe less to others. But I want to talk about the rumor itself and where it came from, and then we can kind of, weigh in on I guess what we think is going on and whether or not it's a good idea. So this story comes from, and I'm going to be pulling from an article from Inside Gaming, which we'll link to down below, and the story comes from a Call of Duty leaker who is like a data miner who has had a couple, correct leaks in the past and has claimed to have a source within Activision as well. So somebody who, by all accounts, is pretty connected, has a track record of being correct in the past when it comes to stuff related to Call of Duty. So that's where this is coming from. The person is called The Ghost of Hope, and they posted about it on Twitter. They said, hearing from trusted sources that the next Xbox is planned to be released in late 2026. Very likely that Call of Duty 2026 is a day one release for it. So that is, I think, obviously a very interesting story, and there's like quite a bit to unpack there right away, right? There's the question of like, Call of Duty 2026 is a day one release. Is that, I mean, the word on the street, right, is that Call of Duty is obviously it can't not be multi-platform for the next at least 10 years.
Yeah, that's
right?
the rule.
And then I think kind of the word on the street, the expectation there, right, is that like there's going to be parity across versions. So it's like, even if they have Call of Duty as like a day one launch title, I don't know how much that really matters, which is
It's just going to seem to come out at the same time as it, I guess. That just gives you more of a time frame than anything else? Because is it going to be on Game Pass? Is that going to be enough of a draw? It's going to launch everywhere, so is that going to be enough of a draw for someone to go, oh, I'm going to buy the Xbox? I don't know what they're going to call it. There's not even a convention to follow, but is anyone going to be like,
we'll just
I'm
call
going to
it
get the
the
new
next
Xbox?
box for now. How about that?
That's good. I like that. Are we going to buy the next box? Oh, because Call of Duty's on it. Which, if it was an exclusive, maybe I could see that. If it was like an Xbox thing of like, oh, I want to get this the best place it can be. But PS5 Pro's going to be out at that point. Who's going to hop over to Xbox. This hasn't been a generation for Xbox right now in terms of software and in hardware, and I think that maybe this is sort of a Nintendo Switch type deal where the Wii U wasn't doing too hot, and they're like, right, let's switch gears, let's try something new, let's focus on
Yeah.
what we are, let's consolidate. And maybe Xbox is thinking of doing something similar, consolidating down to, I don't know, maybe it's focusing on cloud more. Maybe it's making more of an making more of a Game Pass thing. Maybe it's like it's an Xbox themed PC. We don't know what
Yeah,
it is, but
having some other kind of like broader like, differentiator, right? In the way that like the
yeah,
Connect was
yeah.
supposed to be, right? That it was like this is going to be this integral part of the experience, and that'll be a thing that sets us apart. Like I think that
Mhm.
there's probably some credence to that. We have a question that I want to get into a little bit later that I think explores that idea in a bit more detail. But I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense. In their most recent earnings report, Microsoft said that Xbox hardware sales were down 31% year over year. So we if you'll recall, right back when we were reporting on um the lawsuit, right, the ongoing kind of CDC or not CDC, excuse me. That's the Center for Disease Control. The
Yeah, got
FCC case. Uh,
that.
the way different timeline where they're getting involved in Xbox's news. During the FCC case, right, there was that kind of part of Xbox's reasoning for wanting to acquire Activision was that they felt that next gen consoles wouldn't be coming until 2028, right, and that they needed something to kind of help them get ahead during a time when they're behind. And, the idea that maybe um, sales being in decline this much is something that could motivate new hardware, right? Like, because obviously, there was a period where the series consoles were selling pretty well. But I
Mhm.
think, seeing the kind of overall enthusiasm for Xbox diminish over the last couple years because they've just not really delivered on any of their promises, and um they've spent a lot of time and energy kind of trying to set up dominoes for the future. It feels like
Mhm.
the present has, the narrative every year is, oh, this will be Xbox's year, right? This next
Yeah.
one, this next one, this next one.
I think we've said that quite consistently. Like, this seems like they're in a good position now, and
Yeah.
then yeah.
And it just never is that, and I think this last year has really, I think, led a lot of people to kind of have this like enough is enough attitude of like, how many times are we gonna give you the benefit of the doubt before we, you know, recognize that like what you're saying and what you're doing are two different things, or that things are just not working out the way that you think that they're going to. It's like whatever the explanation is, right? Whether it's malice or incompetence, it doesn't really matter, right? Like at the end of the day, Xbox is really good at saying the right thing and then not following up on that as of late. And the idea of them wanting to your point, maybe pull a Nintendo Switch and, pivot to a new device and maybe something that has an interesting gimmick, or like takes them in like a bold new direction, right, is interesting to me, and I think is something that I don't think is outside the realm of possibility, right? Like Xbox has talked a lot about the fact that like they're already actively developing new hardware, right? There was that
Mhm.
what was it? It was the Xbox. I think it was the official Xbox podcast, right, where Sarah Bond was talking about like their next gen roadmap and how that was something that like they're already, she specifically said, I have a quote here. What we're really focused on there is delivering the largest technical leap you will have ever seen in a hardware generation, which makes it better for players and better for creators and the visions that they're building. And then she also said there was like an internal email that was leaked where she said that they were quote unquote moving full speed ahead on that next system.
Yeah, I think
So
all of the console creators are always thinking about the next thing. I don't know how. I just don't see. I mean, I'm sure there's probably someone that can correct me if I'm wrong here, but the way that like PC hardware is moving, for example, I don't see how we can have the biggest technical leap you've ever seen in a hardware generation, considering like
it's already
the leaps
happened.
we've had in the past. Yeah,
Yeah.
right. I just can't imagine that. That just sounds like podcast speak. I say shit all the time on this podcast that is meaningless, and I think that's probably one of them.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with that for sure, and I think this is a great chance to jump into this question we got here from Disco. I'm sorry, Discorrect Angle is the name, and they're
Disco rectangle. It's 2 words.
yeah,
You
Discorrect
said
Angle.
disco rectangle.
Oh, is it Disco Rectangle?
Yeah. There's only one R, so it's not correct.
Oh no, you're right. You're right. You're right. Thank you, Disco
Yeah.
Rectangle. They're a new commenter over on the Discord. Thank you for writing into the show. So they wrote in with a really thoughtful question that I think ties into this main topic really well, which is basically, do we think that PlayStation and Xbox should stop focusing on power? So this is the question. Is a new console generation in Microsoft and Sony's best interest anymore? Previously, they've been able to use more powerful tech and the promises of nicer graphics and faster load times to incentivize users to spend more money on hardware. With the spiraling cost and difficulty now associated with AAA development, and the general sentiment from players that this generation has been a bit of a non-starter, I struggle to see why anyone, including publishers and developers, would be interested in yet more power. Won't this just make it more difficult to actually make a profitable product? The only thing that makes sense in my mind would be for Microsoft and Sony to take a leaf from Nintendo's playbook and start chasing efficiency and portability over power. But even then, that seems like a hard sell.
So, my take on this is that I agree that they should stop focusing on power, but not from a hardware perspective, from a software perspective, because there's always a thing. I think I spoke about this a couple of weeks ago on one of the shows. Actually, I might have been thinking about it in the car while you guys were talking about something else, actually, while I was listening to a show. But it's start of the generation, PS5 and Xbox came out, and it was, let's say PS5 specifically, you had Returnal and you had uh,
Ratchet?
Demon Souls both come out, and Ratchet, yeah, let's say Ratchet as well, where they were like these incredible looking games, 60 FPS locked. They had like all the features out to 11. They were running perfectly. They looked incredible. It's like some of the best stuff you've ever seen in gaming. And it was stuff that you were like made me personally pay attention. I was like, PC can't do stuff. It can, but these games aren't on PC. These games aren't, you know, these things are competing with PC right now, right?
Yeah.
That was the beginning of the generation, and since then, PC has since surpassed the consoles, and I think we feel that in games launching, Hellblade being 30 FPS on Xbox today, for example. There are other examples I can't think of any right now of games that are coming out at 30 FPS on console when they are capable of higher on PC. And for that reason, I think they do need to keep chasing. They do need to keep chasing power when it comes to hardware, because the games are going to be still coming out to take advantage of that, and we are going to end up having games that are 30 FPS if they don't do that. However, the solution to that is specifically from their own teams, for like, I mean here, is they should make their games more scalable, let's say, or they should make their game. They should take a lead from Nintendo in that way of being like, we don't need to have, we shouldn't be sacrificing, uh, frame rate or things like that to be able to make a game. We shouldn't be having like Hellblade, for example. Some of the criticisms being that it's a really, really good looking, technically quite basic in terms of like the actual gameplay side that runs at 30 FPS on the Xbox. When that could have been is more development time could have gone in towards, making the performance better on the system by knocking down some of those settings, for example.
Yeah,
just
but like
on a real
prioritizing
basic
performance
term.
over resolution.
Not even specifically performance, but yeah, definitely performance, but also just like making things that are less wow to look at in a trailer and more wow to play.
Yeah. I don't think there's a better example of that than the conversation we had a few times, right? Like when we talk about AAA development, like and kind of the profitability discussion that's been going on. When you look at something like Tears of the Kingdom, right? Where it's like that was a Game of the Year contender last year. It was, for many people, the best game that came out last year. And it, I think by all, metrics is antiquated in its technology, right? Like, but it was incredibly well optimized, right? And performed extremely well. And, was a game that was like incredibly dynamic and refreshing, and like, I think, we've talked a lot about how, a lot of the most exciting games, that end up coming out, I think at least the most surprising games, right, are not like usually chasing graphics and wow factor like as you know the end all be all, right? It's
Yeah.
like Baldur's Gate was the other game of the year for a lot of people, and it's like that's another game that is like not particularly modern looking, but like it's deep in its gameplay and its experience is exceptional. And I think I definitely think that there's something to be said there when it comes to just how we think about development, that like maybe Sony doesn't need to spend $200 million developing one of these games, right? Like, what is that game?
And 6 years.
Yeah, like what does that same game look like made for half that, right? And like, you just make it smaller, right? Or like less.
Sure, it's not got
laborious, like to make it as like photorealistic as you can.
Yes, yeah. I mean, Tears of the Kingdom didn't look. I mean, it looked fine. It looked like Breath of the Wild. It wasn't blowing anyone away in that respect, but in the gameplay, there was so much going on there and so many things where it was like, there's no way that this works. There's no way that they can do this or this interaction works the way it does. And it did. Like the physics and all that stuff were so well tuned. It was all there. And it was in like a pretty seamless large world,
Well, and I think like I think that because it's stylized too, that like I think that there are a lot of things about it that are beautiful. Like the lighting in it is really good.
Oh yeah, I
agree
agree with that. Yeah. But I'm like from like a pure textures.
Yes, totally.
Models, that sort of stuff. It's not. And also, you do something like Access Ultra Hand, and suddenly it drops down to 20 FPS because all of a sudden it's got to go right. I need to put these parts together, and how does that work and stuff. And the game's, it chugs, but that, we didn't mind as much. We didn't mind at all, really, did we? We were. It wasn't like we were like, oh, this is unplayable.
The experience outweighs those issues,
exactly.
And I think that like I'm totally with you. Where like I think that that's something that we need to hone in on more, because like I think of like how incredible looking Spider-Man 1 and 2 are, right? And it's like those games would still be, say, let's just say for the sake of argument, right? They're 9 out of 10, right? If those games look 25% worse, they would still be 9s out of 10s.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Like that, it's like the fact that they look incredible is a cool thing about it, but it's like you played that game on a base PS4 in 1080 or 720 and you still had a great experience and loved the game because the game is good. It doesn't need to be the most performant, like proving, the ultimate edge of what the console can achieve. Like I don't think that that's that important. And I think if what makes these games more profitable is making them look a little bit worse or whatever, then it's like I think that's where we're going to need to go,
Yeah, but I do also think that they've spent so long using these things as marketing beats, and gamers have these terms like next gen that doesn't really mean anything. This looks next gen doesn't mean anything, but because that is a term, oh, this is a next gen this, people now expect that. Or you cutting edge graphics or ray tracing and stuff like that. Ray tracing on console is fairly meaningless. It does some reflections, cool. It's not even fully really there on PC. Maybe like path tracing and stuff like that. The way the lighting can actually make the game world look better. But there are implementations of ray tracing, like on Spider-Man, where it's like you could. This is the original remaster, by the way. You turn on ray tracing. At least when I played it, the game had to run at 30 FPS, and you have those reflections when you go past windows and that. And it's like, is that worth it, or is that a feature that you've marketed and now you have to offer? And like now people are like, oh, this game needs ray tracing to be any good. But what you've actually done there is sacrifice development time, money, and performance to have this, essentially a buzzword on the box or in the
I
marketing
agree.
stuff.
I definitely feel that way because it's like, think about that. If you just never pushed ray tracing as a feature on consoles, and then you didn't have to develop 2 modes of the game, and you're like, okay, the only mode of the game is performance mode where it runs at 60 FPS because that's what's most important to like the game being a better experience. You have to imagine that saves development budget, right? Like I don't know how much. I don't know if it makes it significantly less, but it's like to me, like those are the kinds of compromises I'd love to see them make, right? Like it's like, and you see that with Nintendo, right? Like we criticize them for it in some ways where it's like, damn, there's no accessibility features in these games, right? But it's also like, it also only runs one way. And it's like, that's the right way. And you're going to play it that way because that's the way we told you to. And it's like, also I think that would be fine, right? Like when it comes to console, that's the experience you should be asking for, right? It's like, to me, I always play my games in performance mode. I never, ever use those other modes. So it's like, I got to imagine that there's a decent percentage of players that are like me and like, don't care about that,
Yeah.
If you cared that much about graphics, you'd play on PC.
like you said about the Switch, there you put the cartridge in as well. The game boots up straight away when it's a Nintendo game because they've God, what's the word? Optimize that game.
Mhm.
Whereas because they need to have these sort of like fidelity modes, you're cramming in textures that maybe don't need to be there, inflating the size of the game and making the downloads bigger and installations bigger, and
Yeah, think
that's a
about how
drag,
like Tears of the
right?
Kingdom is like what, like it's like 18 gigs or something. It's like
Yeah,
it's like less
if
than
that.
20 gigs, right? Like,
Yeah, it might not even be that because it's on the cartridge, and I'm pretty sure they never actually used the bigger cartridges on the Switch.
so yeah, it's
Yeah.
So to take it back to Disco Rectangle's question, right? Of like, is it not in their best interest? I think it's like, I think that's a dynamic question, because I think like obviously, yeah, right. At some point, we need to have a generation
course.
break, and I think at the end of the last two console generations, we felt ready, right? Like I remember playing games like The Last of Us Part 2 or Ghost of Tsushima on my PS4 Pro, and being a few months away from the next gen and being like, yeah, like the promise of these load times, right? Like that's something that I'm really, to this day, that's a huge differentiator that I think we don't talk about enough when we talk about
Yeah,
how
sure.
good these consoles are, that like they're so performant, right? That like
Hmm.
I don't sit at load screens anymore when I use like right now, right? I'm playing Fallout 4 on my Xbox Series X, and like I've never sat at a loading screen for more than 10 seconds, right? Whereas like if you
Yeah.
played that game at launch, you remember that the load screens were like 2 minutes sometimes, and it's like,
Y-
go ahead.
I was playing Penny's Big Breakaway on PC week or two ago, and booted the game up, played it, and I played it a couple of times, and I was like, oh, I'm going to pick it up on the Steam Deck and have a quick go on that. And I booted it up, and I was like, this is weird. I've not seen this before. It was a loading screen that I'd just not seen because I've got like a super fast NVMe SSD in here, and it was running
Yeah.
off an SD card on my Steam Deck. And I was like, oh, this is probably what it's like on the Switch. Is you turn it on and then you have to watch this loading screen happen. And I hadn't seen that on my PC because it was just like, bang, you're in. And like, there's times in games now where you get the in the loading screen, it's like, here's a tip, and you just don't have
You
time to
can't
read
even
that
read the tip. Yeah, exactly.
because
Yeah,
it's gone, and like
totally.
they probably have to put that in there to there are going to be systems that it runs on that don't have the speed. So they're like, well, we need something in here. It's just people like us that have, and people on the new consoles that have the faster SSDs. It's gone. You don't even get to see it. So,
But so like to take it back to the question, because it's like I think you hit on something really salient here though, right? About the whole like with the cost and difficulty associated with AAA development, right? That like we know now the average length of time for a game to be developed has like gone up exponentially, right? I remember a tweet a couple months ago from Jason Schreier who was like, if a AAA studio were to start development on a game right now, it would have to be a PS6 title,
yes, I remember. Yeah.
right? So it's like, I think that's really an interesting point of this idea that like, like Steve and I were talking a couple months ago on this show about like how much the output from specifically Sony's like first party studios has diminished this generation because of how much longer it takes to develop games with like these 4K assets and everything. And like you think about last gen, right? On the PS4, they had what, 3 major releases, 2.5, I guess, but they had Fallout, Uncharted 4, Uncharted Lost Legacy, and The Last of Us Part 2, right? All in one console generation.
Yeah.
This console generation, they've still not put anything out. Like, I mean, there's Last of Us Part 1, right? But it's like, that's we know that's...
And the remake of 2, or the remaster of 2, I should say.
Right. So it's like, those are both, what they are. But they're not new full-fledged projects, right? And they've been working on that
sure.
multiplayer game that's now canceled, right? So it's like, obviously that was another thing that was, I'm sure, taking resources or whatever, but it's like, they're certainly not going to get 3 games out this generation. I think at this point, there's a chance that they don't even get 1, right? Like,
yeah, certainly feels that way. If they're only just starting on, like Jason Schreier said, if they're only just starting on part 3, for example, quite recently, then yeah, when are we going to see that?
And like, I mean, my understanding is that they have a new IP in development, so it's like, who knows how long that's been in development? Maybe that's been in development since The Last of Us Part 2 ended, which means at that point it's been in development for like, what, 4 years,
4 years, yeah.
right? So if it comes out 2-3 more years, that could be like an end of life. But then again, it's like, so what? Like every big studio that you run, like it's one game out a generation now.
Yeah.
It's like that's a
And
bad. That sucks, because I mean, not only is
yeah.
that like tough for the financials and the players and whatever, but like the point that Disco's making here, right? Of like, I don't see why anyone, including publishers and developers, would be interested in yet more power. I hear that, because I think like one of the things we always talked about as an advantage of first parties, right, and an advantage of exclusive games, is that when you're only working with one piece of hardware, you get to know it pretty intimately, and you can see the leap in quality of like between Uncharted 4 and Last of Us Part 2, right? Of like the end of the generation versus the beginning of it, and like how much they're able to eke out of that console near the end of its life cycle, that like you have these games that look incredible, right? And it's like the idea that, you know, if you only get one game per generation, it's like, how are you able to get intimately familiar with the hardware? You can't, right? Like you get one
Because
at
after a
bat.
certain time, you're like, oh, I guess we have to start again because we've just worked out something here. We've worked out how to eke this out. That means going to add even more development time, really, because now you've just worked this thing out, and now your game doesn't look that good. And you're like, oh, well, I guess we'll use that for the next game then, I guess. And at that point, you're already on new hardware.
And I mean, like, we've seen that this generation. Like, look at games like, you know, like Starfield, which is like one of the big releases of last year. Technically a last gen game. It was developed for last gen hardware. Cyberpunk saw the same problem, right? Where it's like it was developed with the last gen hardware in mind, when really it shouldn't have been. It was kind of like stuck in this awkward, like, in between space, you know? And like, you know, I don't know. It is interesting, right? Because like I think that I don't know. Like I don't necessarily agree with the kind of like general perception that like this generation's been a non-starter. Like I think it's really only this year that we've seen any evidence that this generation is significantly different in terms of success than the previous one, right? Like,
yeah, because now we're actually seeing the financials. We're hearing about Insomniac. We're seeing them let people go. We're seeing the sort of post-COVID
and seeing declines, right? Where it's like up until now, it's been like, hey, the PS5 is selling as well as the PS4 did at this time, or better. And it's like, okay, so like, yeah, like people on Twitter and in Discords and stuff are saying like, this generation's slow and there's nothing to play and blah, blah, blah. But it's like, I think that that's an enthusiast attitude, right? That's an attitude coming from somebody that's very dialed in. And when the big new game comes out, you're done with it in a week and you're like, what's next? And like the average person isn't like that, and they don't need to be like that for it to be successful, right? But now it's like seeing, you know, declines in hardware sales and seeing, you know, them not
closures.
Yeah. And it's like those are, you know, those are like I think signs of us being in like kind of a post-boom period, right? Like there was an artificial growth during the pandemic, and that led to, you know, record high sales and returns that were never going to be repeatable. And then you saw those like periods of games not getting worked on, or getting worked on in these kind of staggered, like, you know, hybrid systems as they were developing them. Like that clearly impacted development. So not only do you have these higher expectations for projects, they took longer and more money than they were supposed to. So it's like, I think you're seeing the ramifications of all of that happening all at once now. And it's like, you know, what the long-term effects of that are going to be, I think, are still up in the air. But yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know. I think the kind of like fatigue in the market that there clearly is. I think the fact that like people have less money to throw around on things like new hardware and $70 games and, you know, this and that. It's like, I think those are all factors that are applying a lot of pressure from the top down on the industry. And in we're coming off of kind of a golden age, right, for developers, where like, you know, yeah, we still had layoffs, we still had this, we still had that, but like we had a period where for a long time, like profits were rising year over year, hardware was rising year over year, and, you know, more games were getting made, more smaller experimental titles were getting greenlit, all that stuff. and there was a huge influx of money and attention, and I think you're seeing the other shoe drop where it's like at some point, like, profits plateau and you've reached the amount of people you're going to reach, and maybe there aren't new markets to tap yet, or ever, right? And
Yeah.
that happens all the time. And like, what? There's a question here I want to jump into in the question block that I think follows up on this pretty well, and we'll jump into that in just a second. But before we do that, let me remind you that this episode of the FlipScreen Games podcast is brought to you by our Patreon producers for the month of May. They are, of course, Arnold J. Rimmer, Christopher Valenz, Gabriel Hasselmeyer, a.k.a. Sobe, Snackago, Steve Stompy, Susan Likes Cats and Also Boobies, Voodoo Vic, Ty the Dude, and Wakahula. Thank you all so much for your support over on patreon.com/FlipScreenGames. You're all the real to the real, and we greatly appreciate your support of this and all of our sister shows. Remember, if you want to go check out those sister shows, if you want to show your support, if you want to come join the Discord and keep the conversation rolling, or right into the question block just like a bunch of folks did, you can do all that and much more by heading over to flipscreen.games. That's our website where you will find all the places we are all over the web. However you choose to get involved or show your support, we thank you for tuning into the show. So I want to jump into this question from that Doc guy that I think follows up on this well. Doc said, you mentioned on Nintendo Noise that the cheap commodification of video games is what led to the crash in the late 70s and early 80s, which is what sparked the Nintendo seal of quality. Do you think history is repeating itself? With the quality that even most AAA games are nowadays, in which they are designed to make profit as opposed to being high quality, do you think that video games are going to fall out of the mainstream for a little while, until either Nintendo or another company or an indie studio steps in and reminds everybody what video games are? To be more concise, do you think that the over-commercialization of video games is going to lead to another crash, or do you think the market will recover and once again focus on quality over profit?
I don't think the industry as a whole is in danger, I would say. I think AAA might be having some trouble. The fact that these games cost so much to make, they're not seeing a return on profit. Sony has, Insomniac has released Spider-Man and it sort of was too big. It cost too much to make. Maybe didn't make the return that it needed to. That's why they had to let some people at Insomniac go.
Well, that was also because they canceled the Great Web.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
that was why they let those people go.
Yeah. But I think that the point here at the end, until Nintendo or another company or an indie studio steps in and remind everyone what video games are, I think that still happens. I think the most of the best games this year have been indie games. Most of the there've been so many banger indies every week. This month alone, last month alone, there's been constant new games that are like, this is a genre-defining game. This is like something that we all need. This is like an addicting, Hades 2, Balatro. All of these games that are coming out are constantly reminding us of what these games are. And I just think that it's AAA that's currently in a bit of a slump and has been in a slump for a little while. But now I think that the cost is catching up to, they're not selling as well as they were. They're costing more than they ever did. They're just not actually making as much money as they did. And I think a lot of that possibly also has to do with the fact that people have said there's like black hole games where people are only playing Fortnite, they're only playing Roblox. Kids aren't moving on to, AAA games. They're sticking where they are because they're playing all of these older games, not buying these new games. They're just also very expensive in a time when things are very expensive and people need to live. I think there's a few things in there, and I don't think that it's going to cause a crash, but I do think we will see. We're seeing it. We're seeing Xbox sell things off. We're seeing Sony sell things off, close things down. That is happening. There is like a crash in that way of like talent maybe, but I'm not sure we're going to see the industry as a whole suffer personally. I don't know about you, Pete.
I think it's this is going to sound pointed, but stick with me. I think it's a little more complex than that, because I think that what you're saying is right in many ways. Like, I think there's a lot of aspects of what you said that I agree with. Like, I don't necessarily think we're going to see a crash in the way that we did in the 80s, right? And like what led to, kind of Nintendo resuscitating the business like with an iron fist, right? I don't think that'll ever happen again, because I think the video game industry is like, video games as a thing are a lot more established than they were then. Part of the kind of mindset of the video game crash was that video games were a fad, and I don't think anybody would accuse video games of being a fad at this point, right? Mm-hmm. It's been a extremely profitable multi-billion-dollar industry for a long time, and particularly over the last couple of years, it's become the most profitable form of entertainment. I think the problem, though, is what ends up happening, right, is whenever there's an exciting new technology or medium or whatever, right? Like you have this exact same like trajectory happen where there is, this point where this is a new thing. It's counterculture, right? Like it is controversial. It's not accepted. It's, a niche thing, right? And the people that make it and are involved in it and the people that buy it and support it are a small, dedicated group of passionate people, right? And as something becomes mainstream and it gets more commercialized and like what the definition of what it is widens, then you get all these other people that start to sniff around, and you see big companies like Disney and Amazon and Google and whoever be like, there's money in video games, so I'm going to invest, right? This is exactly what happened in the crash, right? Like one of the famous examples is obviously the E.T. game, right? But like there was like Quaker Oats published a video game on the Atari, right? So it's like clearly it's like, yes, there's money to be made in video games, but you have to make a good video game to make money.
Yeah.
And making a good video game requires a lot of things that are inherently kind of anti-capitalist, right? Art and capitalism are kind of inherently at odds because making the point of making good art, right? Like to borrow from Doc's wording here is to focus on quality, right? It's to focus on in the sense of making a game, right? It's to make something that is fun, that it's emotionally resonant, that is artistically expressive, right? And none of those things are things that capitalism has an interest in unless they make money. And
which is why AI bellends are so hell-bent on AI being the future, because it means you don't have to have quality. You don't have to have someone pouring something into something.
You don't have to pay salaries of hundreds of people, right?
You just say, I think this would make a game. You type it in and you get that thing.
Yeah, it's like, surely that'll work, right? And that's like, I think that's the problem, right? Is like, because like I don't necessarily even agree with like the attitude that like AAA is like devoid of creativity. I think that's kind of a lazy talking point. Like we just talked about like Tears of the Kingdom is a AAA game. That was the most creative game that came out last year.
Absolutely.
And Baldur's Gate 3 is made by an independent studio, but it's a AAA game, right? It costs the amount that AAA games cost. It was in development for like 8 years. Like it's not this little indie game that 5 people made and mortgaged their house. It's not that, right? It's not shovelware.
Yeah.
And, to act like it is just because they're an independent studio and they don't have like a publisher that owns them doesn't take away from what kind of game it is, right? So it's like, I don't necessarily agree that there's like a problem with creativity in games at all. Like I think that like over the last, generation and change, right? Like I'd argue that this is probably the most like creatively rich period in the history of games, right? Like when you look at like how much the like indie scene has grown, how much the kind of re-emergence of AA studios has happened over the last couple of years. The fact that like genres that were like dead and buried for years, like platformers, like Metroidvanias, like point and clicks, like RTS, like has all come back and found a niche where it can be successful. And it doesn't need to be a bestseller. It doesn't need to be AAA or whatever to be successful. It needs to just be good and play to the audience that exists for it, right? Like that to me is a real sign of the fact that like we've been living through a creative renaissance and a golden age for the medium. And that's where I disagree with you, that I actually think that we're in a huge risk of losing that because of the last couple of years. We've seen a lot of changes to the industry that have made a lot of the things that led to that creative boom less and less possible, right? And I think that there are a few things. Some of it is things related to the video game industry and like the market changing, and some of them are totally unrelated to that. I think to start with the unrelated stuff, right? Like, we're living through another major recession. And the ability of, stories like Shovel Knight and Yacht Club, or like Cuphead and Studio MDHR, I think are less and less possible because folks have less money. So the idea that you're going to take a major risk and like mortgage your house to go make a video game and start an independent studio, I think it was always a big risk. It's a even bigger risk now than it was a couple years ago. Right?
It's not like the Stardew Valley story where like your wife can support you.
Yeah, it's like that's probably not something that they could afford to do now, right? That same couple, she probably doesn't make enough money to support 2 people anymore, right? Just because of how wage has changed for the negative. So there's that. I think on top of that, right, with how much consolidation we've seen, more, there are fewer and fewer independent studios, right? And there are fewer and fewer publishers because more and more of them are being acquired and being consolidated. And that leads to layoffs, and there being less jobs to go around and less people to say yes, right? Because, when just using Xbox as an example, right? Not to like specifically pick on them, because I know that they're like, they've been in the hot seat the last 2 weeks on this show.
They really have.
But using them as an example, right? Prior to this generation, if we're an indie studio and we have our little game to publish, right? We could go to Xbox and try to get it published there. We could go to Bethesda and try and get it published there. We could go to Activision and try to get it published there. And like, there were 3 different people that had, a calendar they needed to fill and a certain amount of money to go towards greenlighting small projects and working with independent studios and yada yada. And now that's all one thing. And it's like, yeah, I know that technically that's not true and they're all independent and blah blah blah. But we literally just saw when they were closing down those studios a couple weeks ago, right? Like, one of them was that mobile studio that is redundant now that they own King. Do you think that that's a mistake? Like, that's a coincidence that they've owned that studio for how many years, and they didn't close it down until now when they have another place where their mobile stuff is getting focused on. So it's like, you just hit a point, right, where like there's less money to go around. We had that quote a couple weeks ago from the developer on Darkest Dungeon 2 who said, like, I think the golden age of, indie deals is over. And that, like, the world where you could go and be like, oh, I want to get my game funded, I'll go to Xbox and they'll pay for the entire development cost to put it on Game Pass for a year.
Yeah.
Or I'll go to Epic Game Store and they'll pay the entire development cost for us to put it on their store for a year. That's over. And I think that the idea that, that it's like, that this is just not going to have any effect is, I think the only reason we feel that way is because of how long cycles are, right? Because right now we're just starting to feel the effects of all those delays that happened in 2020, right? Where last year was such a crazy stacked year because all the games that came out on time, all the games that were delayed came out, and it was huge. And then this year, compare this year to last year, how many releases have there been this year that are like setting the world on fire? Not to say that there haven't been lots of good games, there have been. But we talk all the time about how having a few big games in a year feels slow if you're really dialed in. And I think that, yeah, like, I think we're in a real risk of going back to a period like what it was like when we were younger, right? And I think, like, we forget. And if you're a younger gamer, maybe you never lived through that. But like, when you and I were kids, there were like a few big releases a year, and then whatever, AA licensed bullshit, right, that came out, that was the budget titles, and then that was it. And there was no.
That's why we played all that stuff, right? And that's why we now we live in a world where all of our favorite games from our childhood aren't coming to these services like Nintendo Online and stuff like that, because the licenses all fucked up because they were just licensed games because that's all we had.
And you think about, it's only been since the 360 that like the indie publishing route was even an option, right? So it's like, yeah, man, I mean, I think you're in a world where, like, as much as we like to talk shit about AAA, right? We the community. That's what pays for most things is the big releases, and not even necessarily like single player AAA games, but like, like the money makers are the big games, right? And like that was supposed to be the beautiful thing about Game Pass, was that the big games would make money, and then that would allow for the artistic little cool games. And it's like, guess, see how long that lasted, right? And it's just like, the reality is that video games are a business. And I think that, there's always going to be creativity and innovation and exciting things happening in video games because it's an art form. And even if you made it where it was impossible to make a living as a game developer, people would still make games. But I think that we've been spoiled over the last two generations, right? Of there being a real conversation almost every year of like, is this one of the best years in the history of video games? When you really just look at it, like the volume of what came out. And it's like the fact that like you and I have lamented, and Steve, right? We've lamented on the show of like, oh, there's too many games. I can't keep up with them all. It would be great if there was, a pause for 6 months and we could all catch up. And it's like, I mean, man, like we might be getting what we asked for pretty soon. Because we talked about it a few weeks ago about how last year, right? Like 60% of playtime or something like that was from games that didn't come out that year. And that was an all-time great year for releases. And so many people were playing Fortnite and then not even just that though, too, but like stuff like Red Dead Redemption and Fallout 4 and like all these old games that come back in the lexicon, and like people's attitudes towards that, I think, are changing and evolving. And like, I don't know. I think we're coming to a point where the way things have been is going to have to change. And whether that's we reduce budgets on AAA games, and then that means that they're able to be, less restrictive because they don't, signs of, or the, what's the word I'm looking for? Like the level of expectation is reduced, right? Like, I guess that's possible, but like that's the danger of capitalism, right? Once you're a publicly traded company doing your last year's best is failure. And like we hit dizzying heights in this industry in 2020, 2021, and it's like, it's probably never going to happen again, right? And like, unless, executives and board members and stockholders like can reckon with that and accept that like, hey, okay, if it's not a cash cow, I want to get out of the business, or like I have to adjust my expectations for what return on investment is in this industry. I think we have a real risk of seeing more studios close, of seeing more projects get canceled, and to see these publishers and not even just publishers, which is the scarier part, but pin in that, getting more and more risk averse, because the only thing you're going to want to bet on is the surefire thing. And what's the surefire thing? What's already happened. Like it's going to be licensed games and the biggest big name IP. And that's what we grew up in, right? And like that is a very real risk. And I think the bigger scary thing is what that means for creatives. Because if creatives are risk averse, because, I'm Tim Schafer at Double Fine, right? And, I now have this attitude of, all right, well, I have this idea for like stacking, right? Like this weird out there experimental game, right? And I want to make this cool, weird, expressive thing, but is that going to sell? And if it doesn't sell, is my studio going to close? And then all my friends are going to, I'll be fine, right? Because I'm Tim Schafer, but then all these people that work for me, that I have relationships with, and I know their families, and they all depend on me, they're all going to lose their jobs. Yeah. I shouldn't make this game. And it's like, that is the risk. And us coming off this period of creative renaissance, of being able to get weirder, smaller games greenlit by big studios, I think that's over. And like we saw like companies like Take-Two like buy like the Kerbal Space Program team, which was like such a weird, like, why did you buy this studio? It's this independent studio that has one game to their name, and like you decided that you were going to buy them up because reasons, right? Because, oh, it's a boom period. We all got to buy all these small. And then now that you realize, oh, that actually never made sense. They don't fit in our portfolio. Cool. Now that studio's gone, right? Forever. And that IP is probably done forever. And like, I think we're staring down the barrel of that gun right now. And like, a lot of things could change, right? Like inflation could get better. You know, there's all these things that could lead people's purchasing habits to change again, and to have these companies be like, oh, okay, we dodged the bullet, like we've made it through the lean times or whatever. But that's probably not going to happen. It's probably going to get worse before it gets better. And, you know, the tighter the belt gets, the more likely that your favorite studio, that cool indie project that you heard about, like that doesn't happen anymore. And like we've seen it. Like we've seen just these last 2 weeks, successful studios that made offbeat games that don't necessarily sell crazy well get shut down for no other reason than the fact that whatever their next project was is something that someone who is a decision maker, like a bean counter, right, is like, is that going to sell, though? Is another Dishonored game really going to sell? Nah.
Well, now I'm sad. Now I wish when we used to talk about fun things on this show, Pete. I really do.
I do too, and that's I like that bums me out because like I feel like I see it. Like I feel like I see the enthusiasm diminishing, and it's like it's scary to think about. You know that like the industry could be going in a negative direction like that because of these forces that are all outside the control or even like the relevant to like the quality of what's being put out. You know?
Yeah, that is. I'm not as excited as I was anymore.
All right. Do you want to end on a nice note?
Yeah, go on then.
All right. This one comes from Trendy Brandy, who wrote in and said, have you ever participated in a LAN party? What games did you play? My friends and I are getting set up to play Elden Ring with the seamless co-op mod, and I'm super excited. Also, any quick Elden Ring tips for a first-time player? Just upgraded my computer, and it works.
Magic. If you're struggling, just go Magic. That's the tip. LAN party. I technically have the Switch has been the LAN party renaissance for me. I used to drag my Wii U around, and I was the only person that had a Wii U. So if I was going to a friend's house, I'd take the Wii U and we'd play games. However, with the Switch, me and like my friend and his brother, we would play games together. And one of my friend's girlfriends, we'd be like, let's play some Overwatch. I'll come around. I'll go around there, and we'd all have Overwatch on our Switches. We'd take turns docking it for charge, and we would just the five of us play Overwatch together on the Switch for hours at a time. Monster Hunter, buddy of mine would come around. We would play, I don't know, 8 hours of Monster Hunter at a time, just sort of sat at one of our houses. And now we have Steam Decks and other similar systems. We're going to do the same with the next Monster Hunter that comes out. You know, the handheld PC market, or sorry, the handheld games console market, is the way that it is now. You get these sort of fuller, full-fledged games on these things. For me, LAN parties are coming back in a big way. But also, my boss goes to a LAN party every single year. They all lug their PCs. This year, he was like, I might just take my ROG Ally and I can just plug that in. I don't have to lug a huge PC. I can just take this little thing. And I think that's going to make LAN parties more accessible for people. They don't have to, I'm scared about traveling with my PC or all that sort of stuff. It makes it easier for you. So, yeah.
Definitely.
I can see that happening. How about you, Pete? You played any LAN parties recently?
Not recently. I think the most famous story I have for it is, I want to say it was my, I don't remember what birthday it was, but it was a birthday in my 20s, and I had a LAN party at my dad's house back before I had moved to Philly, and I had like, I don't know, maybe like 20 or 30 of my friends over or whatever. And we had the entire like downstairs of my dad's house. I had like set up multiple stations, basically. Like we had the TV in the living room that was normally there. And I had, I think Halo set up in that room or something. Mm-hmm. And then we had a CRT in one room that had a GameCube with Melee hooked up. We had We had the Switch set up with the modern Smash and Mario Kart, and then we had one room where a bunch of my friends brought PCs and we hooked them all together, and we had like it was 4 rigs like in a row, so you could do like like a proper like traditional LAN thing, and like we played some Quake and like a couple other like arena shooters like that like you were supposed to do. Obviously you don't need to do a LAN anymore for that, but it's like this is what you're felt very appropriate or whatever. But that was also the first time I played Quit Talking and Nobody Explodes. Stop talking.
Yes. Stop
Keep
talking.
talking.
Nobody
Keep
explodes.
talking.
Keep talking and nobody explodes. Yeah.
That was the first time I ever played that game, which is like one of my most vivid memories of that party, because I was like, damn, this is it's a fun game generally, but in a party environment where there's like people watching, like, it's like it's so much more distracting to be like, I'm trying to do Morse code. Shut up. Like, So that was a really fun experience, to be sure. It was like people just taking turns trying to get through a round or whatever.
You reminded me that I guess it's not quite the same, but like stuff like Jackbox is a very easy way to just engage a room and stuff. I guess that's more of a party game than like actually like having a LAN party kind of thing. But yeah, having games be available in more places and in more ways is a great way to be able to do that.
Yeah, definitely. So there we go. We ended on a nice note.
that was nice. What lovely memories we both shared there.
What lovely memories. So if you guys want to write in and let us know what you think about any of this week's topics, like how are you feeling about the idea of a next gen Xbox? Is that something that you think makes sense this soon? If so, what do you want it to look like? Is more power the thing? Is there a gimmick you can think of that would maybe push you over? Some kind of Game Pass integration? I'm interested to hear what people think, and if it's something that anybody is interested in, because I feel like I can't imagine that there's anybody in the audience that's out there clamoring for the next box right now. But if you are, let us know why. I'd be interested to hear. And then, of course, if you want to, comment on this or any of the other stuff we talked about this week, make sure you write in all the ways that you can, and you can get your thoughts and opinions read during the question block. There's a bunch of ways you can do that, all of which you can find over at flipscreen.games. That's our website where you will find links to all the places we are all over the web, however you choose to get involved or show your support. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the FlipScreen Games podcast. For the crew, I've been Pete. He's been Max. We'll see you next week.